Frank Castellano stood motionless before the toy store window on Fifth Avenue, while Christmas shoppers flowed around him like water parting for a stone. His cashmere coat cost more than most families spent on rent. His leather gloves were custom-made in Florence, yet he looked like a man who'd forgotten how to inhabit his own skin. The display before him showed an automated winter village, where ceramic children ice-skated in eternal circles, and a mechanical rabbit in a waistcoat checked a pocket watch that never told the actual time. The rabbit's paw moved up and down with metronomic precision, reaching for the watch, pulling back, reaching again in a loop that had no purpose beyond its own repetition. Frank's breath fogged the glass in rhythmic clouds that matched his heartbeat, slow and heavy, the breathing of someone who'd stopped expecting anything to change. Behind him, the city celebrated with violent enthusiasm, but the sounds reached him muffled, as if he were underwater watching life happen to other people. His phone buzzed for the 7th time in 3 minutes, calls from associates who needed decisions only he could make, whose livelihoods depended on his attention. Frank silenced it without looking, a small act of rebellion that would have consequences he couldn't bring himself to care about. The mechanical rabbit kept checking its watch, trapped in purpose without meaning, and Frank understood it perfectly. He'd been standing there 22 minutes according to the Patek Philippe on his wrist, a timepiece worth $40,000 that couldn't tell him why he'd driven here instead of going home. The toy store had been his destination without being his choice, his hand steering the car while his mind drifted through decades of carefully constructed emptiness. Something about the window display had snagged his attention 3 Christmases ago, and he'd returned each year since, though he couldn't articulate what he was looking for. The rabbit wore a burgundy waistcoat, with brass buttons that caught the light, its painted eyes holding an expression of permanent mild concern. Frank's reflection in the glass superimposed over the scene, turning him into a giant haunting the miniature world, too large to enter and too fascinated to leave. His face looked wrong somehow, like he'd forgotten how to arrange his features into human expressions. A woman passing with shopping bags glanced at him, then quickly away, recognition and fear crossing her face in rapid succession. Frank Castellano was known in certain circles, his name spoken carefully, his presence noted and avoided. He'd built an empire through intelligence and ruthlessness, had made decisions that kept hundreds employed and dozens terrified, yet none of it had prepared him for the particular loneliness of standing before a toy store wanting something he couldn't name. The mechanical rabbit's watch read 11:47, frozen there forever, while Frank's watch showed 6:33 in the evening. Time passed differently inside the display, where nothing changed and nothing needed to, where the ceramic children would skate forever without growing tired or cold. He pressed his palm flat against the glass, feeling the chill transfer through expensive leather, wanting to break through into that simpler world. His chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the December air, a pressure that had been building for months, or perhaps years. Frank had forgotten when he'd last felt something that wasn't anger or emptiness, when he'd last wanted something beyond the next deal or the next strategic move. The rabbit checked its watch again, the same motion it had made 10,000 times, and Frank envied its certainty of purpose. Behind the rabbit, miniature presents wrapped in paper too perfect to be real, sat under a tree that sparkled with lights the size of pinheads. Everything in the display was designed to evoke joy, to remind viewers of childhood wonder, but Frank felt only absence. His own childhood had been a series of lessons in survival, each one teaching him that vulnerability was weakness and connection was liability. He'd mastered those lessons so thoroughly that he'd forgotten they were supposed to be temporary, tools for surviving youth rather than blueprints for building a life. Now at 32, Frank commanded respect and obedience from everyone he encountered, but couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him with simple human warmth. The rabbit's painted smile never wavered, permanently pleasant, permanently meaningless. Snow began falling in lazy spirals, fat flakes that caught the light from the store window and turned golden before landing on Frank's shoulders. The cold should have driven him away by now, should have sent him back to his penthouse with its view of the city and its expensive furniture that no one ever sat on. Instead, he remained rooted, watching the rabbit, breathing fog onto glass, waiting for something he couldn't identify. His phone buzzed again, Marco's name flashing on the screen, his second-in-command who ran daily operations with brutal efficiency. Frank let it go to voicemail, an act of negligence that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, when every call was answered, and every decision was immediate. Something had been eroding inside him, a foundation crumbling so slowly he'd barely noticed, until he found himself unable to care about things that used to matter. The mechanical rabbit reached for its watch, and Frank's hand on the glass mirrored the motion without conscious thought. For a moment, they were synchronized. Man and machine both reaching for time that wouldn't come, both trapped in gestures that had lost their meaning. The snow fell heavier now, beginning to accumulate on the sidewalk, and still Frank didn't move. A child's laughter cut through the general noise of the street, high and clear, the sound of someone who hadn't learned yet that joy required justification. Frank's head turned slightly, tracking the sound without finding its source, his body responding to something his mind had long ago decided was irrelevant. The rabbit checked its watch, the ceramic children skated their circles, and the presents under the miniature tree remained unopened forever. Frank's reflection in the glass showed a man who'd succeeded at everything except becoming human, who'd built an empire on the ruins of his own capacity for connection. His eyes were dry, because he'd forgotten how to cry years ago, had trained himself out of the weakness of tears. The mechanical rabbit's painted eyes held more expression than his real ones, more suggestion of feeling behind the surface. He thought about leaving, getting back in his car, returning to his life of controlled isolation and strategic interactions. His hand remained pressed against the glass, his breath continued fogging it, and his feet refused the command to move. The toy store window held him like gravity, like quicksand, like the last place in the world where he could admit he was drowning. The rabbit checked its watch one more time as Frank's phone buzzed again, and somewhere in the growing darkness, a small voice called out with perfect clarity. The sound carried through the snow and the crowd, reaching Frank where he stood frozen, and for the first time in 23 minutes, his attention shifted away from the window. His hand slipped from the glass, leaving a palm print that fogged and faded, and he turned toward a presence he hadn't noticed approaching. Luna Martinez had been watching the sad man for 6 minutes and 40 seconds, counting in her head the way Magnolia taught her when she needed to be patient. She stood 12 feet away with her pink knit hat pulled low over her ears, the bunny ear flaps bouncing slightly when she tilted her head to study him better. Her small hands clutched a stack of yellow flyers advertising tomorrow's theater performance, the paper already damp from snow. Magnolia was 3 stores down, talking to the bookstore owner about posting flyers in the window, her voice carrying faintly on the winter air as she negotiated with tired cheerfulness. Luna had been instructed to stay visible, to not wander, to wait patiently until Mama finished her conversation. But the man at the toy store window hadn't moved in all the time Luna had been watching, and something about his stillness felt wrong in a way that made her chest hurt. She'd seen sad people before in the neighborhood where she and Magnolia lived, people sitting on stoops with empty eyes or shuffling past without noticing the world around them. This man was different, because his sadness wore expensive clothes and stood in a place where children were supposed to feel happy. His hand on the glass reminded Luna of how she used to touch the aquarium at the dentist's office, wanting to be inside with the fish, where everything moved slowly, and nothing was too loud. The man's shoulders held tension that looked painful, hunched forward slightly, as if he were trying to disappear into the window display itself. Luna knew about wanting to disappear, because she remembered fragments of the group home before Magnolia adopted her. The crowded rooms where being noticed usually meant being denied something you wanted. This man looked like he wanted to unbecome himself, to dissolve into the falling snow, and stop existing. And Luna understood that feeling better than a 6-year-old probably should. Magnolia's laugh floated from the bookstore entrance, bright and genuine despite the exhaustion Luna knew was hiding underneath it. Mama worked so hard to keep the theater running, to create magic for children who needed it, and Luna had learned to read the subtle signs of worry that Magnolia tried to hide. They had each other, though, which was more than the man at the window seemed to have, and Luna felt a pull of recognition that transcended logic. She took 3 steps closer, her small boots crunching in the fresh snow, before remembering Magnolia's rules about talking to strangers. But Magnolia had also taught her that kindness was more important than rules when someone was truly hurting, and Luna had developed instincts for reading adult pain. The man still hadn't moved, hadn't noticed her approach, remained locked in whatever private grief held him captive before the mechanical displays. Luna studied his profile against the lit window, the sharp line of his jaw, and the hollow quality around his eyes that made him look like he'd forgotten how to sleep. His coat was open despite the cold, as if temperature didn't register anymore, as if physical sensation had become irrelevant. She recognized that disconnection from something Magnolia called checking out, when feelings became too big, and the only solution was to stop feeling entirely. The flyers in her hands advertised The Brave Little Rabbit, a show Magnolia had written about a rabbit who learned that being small didn't mean being powerless. Luna played the rabbit, wore ears just like the ones on her hat, and delivered lines about courage that Magnolia said she embodied naturally. The man at the window was staring at a mechanical rabbit in a waistcoat, and Luna wondered if the universe was trying to tell her something through the coincidence. She took 2 more steps, close enough now that she could see the fog from his breathing on the glass, close enough to notice his hand trembling slightly against the window. Adults weren't supposed to tremble unless they were very cold or very scared, and this man looked like he'd forgotten how to be afraid of anything, except whatever lived inside his own head. Luna had nightmares sometimes about the group home, about being alone again, and Magnolia would hold her and remind her that fear was just a feeling, not a fact. The man's phone lit up again in his pocket, the glow visible through the expensive fabric, but he ignored it with the same determination he'd ignored the previous calls. Luna knew that ignoring something important usually meant you were dealing with something more important, and she tried to imagine what could be more important than whatever made phones buzz with urgency. Maybe he was ignoring the call because answering it would mean pretending to be okay, and he'd run out of energy for pretending. Magnolia's voice called her name, gentle but clear, a reminder that Luna had wandered beyond the agreed-upon boundary. But Luna's feet had carried her to within 6 feet of the man, close enough to see the designer label on his coat and the quality of leather in his gloves, markers of wealth that seemed obscene next to the depth of his misery. Rich people weren't supposed to look this broken, at least not in the stories Luna knew, where money solved problems instead of creating them. She watched him watch the mechanical rabbit, both of them locked in observation, both of them separate from the flow of holiday shoppers streaming past. The rabbit's tiny paw reached for the watch, pulled back, reached again, trapped in purposeless repetition. The man's chest rose and fell with breathing that looked like it required conscious effort, like he had to remind himself that living meant continuing to take in air and let it out. Luna shifted her weight from foot to foot, the flyers crinkling in her grip, working up the courage to speak. Magnolia had taught her that words had power, that the right sentence at the right moment could change someone's entire day. The man needed something. That much was obvious. But Luna wasn't sure what she could possibly offer that would matter to someone who could afford to ignore phone calls and stand in the cold without caring. His reflection in the glass showed exhaustion so complete, it had become a kind of paralysis, the face of someone who'd stopped believing that movement would lead anywhere worth going. Luna knew that feeling from the months after her adoption, when she'd waited for Magnolia to change her mind and send her back, when she'd been afraid to want anything because wanting led to losing. She'd been wrong about Magnolia, though. Wrong about whether it was safe to hope. The mechanical rabbit checked its watch. Snowflakes melted on Luna's pink bunny ears, and Magnolia called her name again with more urgency. Luna took one final step forward, close enough now that the man would surely notice her presence, close enough to commit to whatever she was about to do. Her heart hammered with the nervousness of approaching adult sadness, but her feet stayed planted, and her voice prepared itself for speech. She thought about the brave little rabbit in tomorrow's performance, about the lines she'd memorized about courage being quieter than people expected. The man's hand slipped from the glass, leaving behind a fading palm print, and Luna saw his shoulders shift as he prepared to turn away. Something about that motion felt final, like he was about to walk back into whatever life was crushing him, and Luna's mouth opened before her nerve could fail. The words came out softer than she'd intended, barely audible over the street noise and the falling snow, but they were enough to make the man freeze mid-turn, enough to make him look down and discover the small girl in the pink bunny-eared hat standing close enough to matter. His eyes met hers, and Luna saw surprise register on his face, followed by confusion about why a child would be speaking to him at all. "Don't be sad, sir," Luna said, with the earnest directness of someone who hadn't learned yet that adults preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truth. Her voice carried the slight lisp she was working on in speech therapy, turning the S sounds softer than intended. The flyers in her hands trembled slightly, but she held the man's gaze with determination that came from genuinely caring about his suffering, rather than from any expectation of reward. Frank stared down at the child as if she'd materialized from the toy store window itself, a small person with impossible pink ears and eyes that held concern no stranger should feel. He opened his mouth to respond, but discovered he'd forgotten how to talk to children, how to modulate his voice into something non-threatening. The silence stretched between them while snow accumulated on both their shoulders. One pair expensive and hunched, one pair small and square with conviction. "You were crying," Luna continued, though Frank's face was completely dry, and he realized she'd been watching him long enough to witness the internal collapse even his trained exterior couldn't fully hide. She shifted the flyers to one hand and used the other to gesture at the toy store window. The bunny in there is stuck, but you don't have to be stuck. Mama says being stuck is just forgetting that doors can open. Magnolia appeared at Luna's shoulder with the protective speed of a mother who'd found her child talking to a strange man, her hand landing gently but firmly on her daughter's shoulder. Her eyes took in Frank's expensive clothes and hollow expression with rapid assessment, reading danger and damage in equal measure. "Luna, sweetheart, we talked about boundaries," she said, her voice kind but definite, already beginning to steer her daughter away from potential threat. "But Mama, he's so sad," Luna protested without breaking eye contact with Frank, displaying the stubborn compassion that Magnolia both loved and feared in her daughter. "Sadder than Mr. Chen was when his restaurant closed. Sadder than you were when the theater almost shut down last year. He needs help, but doesn't know how to ask for it, because asking would mean admitting he's breakable." Frank felt something crack in his chest at the child's words, spoken with such matter-of-fact kindness that they bypassed every defense he'd spent decades constructing. His throat worked soundlessly for a moment before he found words. "I'm fine," he managed, the lie automatic and unconvincing, his voice rougher than intended. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm perfectly fine." Luna's expression shifted to something between disappointment and determination, the look of someone who'd been lied to enough times to recognize the taste of it. She held up the yellow flyers, their message about tomorrow's performance blurred slightly by snowmelt. "We're having dinner at the theater tonight because Mama has to finish the props, and I help with glue and glitter. It's just pasta and the sauce from a jar, but Mama makes it taste special with basil from our window garden." Magnolia's grip on Luna's shoulder tightened slightly, maternal protection warring with her own instinct for reading human need. She studied Frank more carefully now, seeing past the expensive exterior to the particular quality of desperation that marked someone dangerous only to themselves. "Luna, we can't just invite strangers to," she began, but her daughter's hand reached out and gently touched Frank's gloved fingers where they hung at his side. "You can dine with us," Luna said with simple authority, as if she were conferring a great gift rather than offering charity, as if feeding him were the most natural thing in the world. "You don't have to talk if words are too heavy right now. You can just sit and eat and be somewhere that isn't lonely. Mama's really good at making spaces feel safe even when your brain is telling you nothing is safe anymore." Frank looked from the child to the mother, seeing wariness in Magnolia's eyes, but also a softness that suggested she might not override her daughter's invitation, despite every practical reason to do so. He should refuse, should return to his car and his empty penthouse, should maintain the boundaries that kept his world separate from normal human interaction. Instead, he heard himself say, "I don't want to impose," which wasn't a refusal at all. "You're not imposing if we're inviting," Luna countered with logic that allowed no argument, her small hand still resting on his fingers, in a touch so light it was barely physical, but heavy with significance. "Mama always says the theater has enough magic for people who need it most, and you need it more than anyone I've seen, except maybe me before I got adopted. You look like you forgot you're allowed to be somewhere warm." Magnolia made a decision Frank saw across her face, weighing her daughter's safety against her own ability to read whether this expensively dressed stranger posed actual danger. Something in his eyes must have convinced her that he was more broken than threatening, because she sighed with acceptance. The Cornerstone Theater, 6 blocks west on Maple Street, the red door with the brass knocker shaped like comedy and tragedy masks. "Come if you want. No pressure, no expectations, just pasta and company if you need it." Frank nodded slowly, the gesture feeling foreign after standing motionless for so long, his body remembering how to respond to human interaction. Luna smiled with such pure satisfaction at his acceptance that Frank felt something shift in his chest, a small crack in the ice that had formed around his capacity to feel. The child released his hand and took her mother's, turning to leave, but glancing back once with encouragement that assumed his arrival rather than hoping for it. They walked away through the falling snow, the small girl in pink bunny ears, and the tired woman in the gray wool coat, their heads bent together in conversation Frank couldn't hear. He watched them disappear into the stream of shoppers, 2 people who'd offered kindness to a stranger without knowing his name or his capacity to repay them. The mechanical rabbit in the window checked its watch, and Frank looked at his own timepiece, noting he had 90 minutes before the invitation became either a choice or a missed opportunity. His phone buzzed again, and this time Frank pulled it out to see 7 missed calls from Marco, 3 from his attorney, 2 from business associates whose deals waited on his approval. The weight of his empire pressed against his attention, demanding he return to being Frank Castellano, who made decisions and inspired fear, who controlled territory and commanded respect. The child's words echoed in his memory about being stuck versus remembering that doors could open, about being somewhere warm instead of somewhere lonely. He typed a message to Marco with cold fingers. Handle everything. Don't contact me unless the building is literally on fire. He sent it before second-guessing the abdication of responsibility, before remembering all the reasons he couldn't afford to disappear for an evening. The mechanical rabbit reached for its watch, and Frank realized he'd been checking time that didn't matter while refusing to acknowledge time that did, counting minutes instead of living them. The toy store window reflected his face against the miniature village, but the desperate emptiness had shifted into something else, a nervous anticipation he barely recognized as hope. Frank had forgotten what it felt like to be invited somewhere without ulterior motive, to be offered kindness from someone who gained nothing from his presence. A child had looked at his expensive misery and decided he needed pasta more than he needed isolation, and the simple illogic of that assessment had undone something in him. He turned away from the window finally, his body obeying a decision his mind hadn't fully processed, his feet carrying him toward his car, and the choice that waited 6 blocks west on Maple Street. The snow fell heavier now, transforming the city into something softer than it had been, muffling sounds and blurring edges until everything felt slightly unreal. Frank walked through it like a man leaving one life without quite arriving at another, suspended between what he'd been and what he might become if he allowed himself to walk through a red door. Frank found the Cornerstone Theater 20 minutes later, though he'd circled the block twice before accepting that the modest red door was actually his destination. The building wedged itself between a laundromat and a closed print shop, its facade showing decades of weather damage and amateur repairs. Paint peeled around the brass knocker Magnolia had mentioned, the comedy and tragedy masks tarnished to near black, and through a ground-floor window he could see lights that flickered with the inconsistency of old wiring. He stood outside longer than necessary, his hand hovering near the door, arguing with himself about the wisdom of entering a stranger's workspace based on a child's invitation. His world operated on calculated risk and strategic advantage, on knowing all variables before committing to action. This situation offered no calculation beyond the memory of Luna's small hand on his fingers, and the surprising absence of judgment in Magnolia's tired eyes when she'd extended the invitation, despite obvious reservations. The door opened before Frank could knock, Luna's face appearing in the gap, with a grin that suggested she'd been watching for his arrival. "You came," she said with satisfaction rather than surprise, pulling the door wider to reveal a narrow hallway painted sunshine yellow. "Mama said you might not because grown-ups sometimes decide being alone is safer than being with people who might see them clearly. But I knew you'd come because you're braver than you think you are." Frank stepped inside and was immediately struck by the smell of tomato sauce and basil competing with paint fumes and something sweet he couldn't identify. The hallway led past a small box office booth, empty except for a cash register that looked older than Frank himself, its brass keys gleaming from frequent polishing. Luna closed the door behind him and took his hand without asking permission, her small fingers confident as she led him deeper into the building's surprisingly labyrinthine interior. "The theater is back here," Luna explained, navigating turns that seemed designed to confuse rather than guide, passing storage closets with half-open doors revealing costume racks and prop weapons, and what appeared to be a dragon head constructed from papier-mâché. "Mama bought this building for almost nothing because nobody wanted it after the old movie theater closed. She says diamonds hide in places people stop looking, and she was right because this place has the best acoustics in the whole neighborhood, even if the roof leaks when it rains hard." They emerged into the main theater space, and Frank stopped moving entirely, arrested by the unexpected beauty of what Magnolia had created from obvious poverty. The room seated perhaps 60 people in mismatched chairs that had been painted uniform deep blue, their arrangement creating intimate rows that curved slightly toward a stage elevated only 2 feet from the floor. The stage itself was small, maybe 15 feet across, but Magnolia had transformed it into something that transcended its dimensions through pure creative determination. Hand-painted backdrops hung on a pulley system, depicting forests and castles and night skies with stars that looked like they'd been applied with patient fingerprints. The curtains were velvet that had seen better decades, their burgundy faded to dusty rose in places, but they'd been mended with such care that the repairs became part of their character. Stage lights cobbled together from salvaged equipment cast warm pools on the playing space, and Frank recognized the particular quality of illumination that came from someone who understood how light could transform cheap materials into magic. Magnolia stood center stage with a paintbrush in her hand, touching up a tree that would serve as tomorrow's forest, her movements economical and precise. She'd removed her coat to reveal a green cardigan worn soft with age, her blonde ponytail swinging as she worked. She looked up when Luna and Frank entered, surprise and something more complicated crossing her face, before settling into welcoming determination. "You actually came," she said, her voice carrying easily in the space designed for projection. "I'm glad." Luna would have been disappointed, and I've learned that my daughter's instincts about people are usually more accurate than my protective paranoia. Frank descended 3 steps to the theater floor, his expensive shoes silent on carpet that had been patched but recently vacuumed, his hands uncertain about where to rest. "Thank you for the invitation," he managed, his voice sounding too formal for the intimate space. "I hope I'm not intruding on your work time. I can leave if you need to focus on preparations." "You're not intruding on anything that matters more than human connection," Magnolia replied, setting down her paintbrush with finality and wiping her hands on a rag that had once been a t-shirt. "Luna, can you show our guest where to sit while I check on the pasta? The timer should go off in about 3 minutes, and if I let it overcook again, we'll be eating rubber noodles." She disappeared through a door stage left that presumably led to whatever served as the theater's kitchen, leaving Frank alone with Luna in the space that hummed with creative energy. Luna led him to the front row and patted the seat beside where she'd clearly established her own territory, a coloring book and box of crayons spread across 2 chairs. "Mama built all of this herself," she said with fierce pride, gesturing at the stage and its decorations. People told her she couldn't run a children's theater without investors or grants or business partners, but she did it anyway because she believes stories can heal people. She healed me with stories when I first came home and couldn't sleep through the night without crying. Frank lowered himself into the indicated seat, the chair creaking slightly under his weight but holding firm, and found himself at eye level with Luna's coloring book. She'd been working on a picture of a rabbit in a waistcoat, the colors carefully applied within the lines, the bunny's expression determined rather than cute. "Is this for your performance tomorrow?" he asked, surprised by his own interest, by the genuine curiosity that replaced his usual polite detachment. "It's the brave little rabbit," Luna confirmed, selecting a brown crayon to shade the rabbit's fur with short, careful strokes. "He's little, and everyone thinks he can't do important things because of his size. But he saves the whole forest by being brave in small ways that add up to something big. Mama wrote it for me after I told her I felt too small to matter at my new school. She said mattering isn't about size. It's about showing up with your whole heart even when you're scared." The simplicity of the moral landed harder than Frank expected, cutting through his defenses with the precision of truth spoken by someone too young to dress it in comfortable euphemism. He'd spent 3 decades showing up with strategic fractions of himself, calculating how much to reveal and how much to hide, never considering that wholeness might be an option. Luna continued coloring with absorption that suggested his presence had become comfortable background rather than intrusive foreground, and Frank felt something in his chest unclench slightly. Magnolia returned carrying a tray that held 3 mismatched bowls of pasta, the tomato sauce steaming and smelling of garlic and that basil he'd noticed earlier. She'd added a basket of bread that looked bakery fresh and 3 glasses of water, the meal simple, but assembled with care. "Luna, clear your art supplies so we have room for dinner. Frank, may I call you Frank? You never actually introduced yourself, but Luna whispered that she heard me use your first name when I was thinking out loud about whether to worry about you showing up." Frank accepted the bowl she handed him, the ceramic warm against his palms, and realized he'd been recognized despite his attempt at anonymity. "You know who I am," he said, not quite a question, waiting for the shift in her demeanor that always came when people connected his face to his reputation. His appetite, barely existent moments ago, died completely as he prepared for the inevitable change in how she looked at him. "I know what people say about you," Magnolia corrected gently, settling into the chair on Luna's other side and handing her daughter a smaller bowl. "I know you're connected to businesses that operate in moral gray areas, and I know you have the kind of power that makes restaurant owners give you the best table without asking. I also know you stood crying in front of a toy store window for 30 minutes, which tells me more about who you actually are than any reputation possibly could. We're not judging your past in this theater. We're just offering you pasta in the present." Luna was already eating with the unselfconscious enthusiasm of childhood, tomato sauce collecting at the corner of her mouth as she twirled spaghetti with more determination than skill. Frank looked down at his bowl, at the simple meal offered without conditions or expectations. and felt the weight of genuine kindness settle over him like a blanket. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the fork, the tremor visible enough that Magnolia noticed but didn't comment, and he took his first bite of food that tasted like it had been prepared with attention rather than just assembled from ingredients. "This is really good," he said, the words inadequate but sincere, and Magnolia's face softened with pleasure at the compliment that clearly mattered more, because it came from someone who'd forgotten how to be pleased by simple things. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by Luna's occasional observations about her coloring, or questions about whether Frank liked rabbits, her presence somehow making it acceptable for two adults to share space without the pressure of meaningful conversation. The theater's kitchen turned out to be a converted storage room barely large enough for 3 people to stand without touching, its walls lined with open shelving that held mismatched dishes and props awaiting repair. A hot plate served as the stove, a mini fridge hummed in the corner, and a small table with a surface scarred from years of use dominated the center of the space. Magnolia had moved their dinner here after Luna announced she wanted to show Frank where real conversations happen, apparently distinguishing between the performance space and this intimate room where pretense wasn't required. Frank sat with his knees nearly touching the table's edge, the chair too small for his frame, but he didn't mention the discomfort. Luna had positioned herself directly across from him with the intense focus of a child conducting an investigation, her bunny ear hat finally removed to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. She'd finished her pasta, but continued playing with her remaining piece of bread, tearing it into small pieces that she arranged into patterns on her napkin, while studying Frank with disconcerting directness. "Why were you crying at the toy store?" Luna asked finally, the question delivered with the bluntness of someone who hadn't learned that some subjects required social dancing. Magnolia's hand moved toward her daughter's arm in gentle warning, but Frank shook his head slightly, indicating he didn't mind the interrogation. The child's directness felt refreshing after years of conversations where everything important remained unspoken beneath layers of strategic politeness. Frank set down his fork and considered his answer, aware that Luna would detect any attempt to soften the truth into something more palatable. "I wasn't exactly crying," he began, then stopped because that was already a lie. "Actually, I was crying without tears, which sounds impossible, but happens when you've forgotten how to let feelings reach your face. I was standing there trying to remember the last time I wanted something that wasn't about control or safety or proving I was stronger than whatever tried to break me when I was young." Luna's eyes widened slightly at his honesty, but she nodded with the solemnity of someone recognizing familiar territory. "I cried without tears too when I first came to live with Mama," she said, her bread piece arrangement forgotten. "The social worker said I was probably traumatized, which is a big word that means scared and hurt at the same time. Mama told me tears would come back when my body remembered it was safe to feel things, and she was right. Now I cry at sad movies, and when kids at school are mean, and sometimes just because the sunset is so pretty, it makes my chest hurt." Magnolia refilled Frank's water glass, though it was still half full, the gesture giving her hand something to do, while emotions moved across her face. "Luna was at a group home before the adoption," she explained quietly, her eyes on the water pitcher, rather than Frank's face. "She came to one of our early performances with a foster family, and I watched her watch the show with this hunger for story that I recognized because I'd felt it myself growing up. After the performance, she asked me if the characters could come live with her because she wanted to practice being brave like them. I knew then that we were supposed to find each other." Frank absorbed this information, understanding clicking into place about the particular quality of connection between mother and daughter that transcended simple biology. "How old was she when you adopted her?" he asked, genuinely curious about the mechanics of choosing to become a parent to a child who'd already experienced loss. His own childhood had been a series of temporary placements and institutional settings, nobody ever choosing him permanently, and he tried to imagine what his life might have looked like if someone like Magnolia had decided he was worth the commitment. 18 months old when I got her, which sounds young except she'd already learned that adults were temporary and affection was conditional, Magnolia said, her voice carrying the weight of those early difficult months. "She didn't cry for the first 6 weeks, just watched me with these enormous eyes, waiting for me to prove I was like all the others. I had to show her through consistent presence that I wasn't going anywhere, that her permanence in my life wasn't dependent on her being easy or grateful or anything except exactly who she was." Luna reached across the table and touched Frank's hand where it rested near his empty bowl, her fingers sticky from bread, but her touch grounding him to the moment. "You look like you're still waiting for someone to choose you," she observed with devastating accuracy. Like you built a big wall because nobody came to get you when you needed them. And now you're the boss of everything, but you're still alone behind the wall. That's sadder than being alone because you don't have choices. You have all the choices, but you're still alone. The assessment landed with physical force, and Frank felt his throat close around words that wanted to emerge but couldn't form. He'd constructed his entire adult life around the premise that independence was victory, that needing no one meant no one could abandon him. Luna's small observation revealed the emptiness of that victory, with such clarity that denial seemed pointless. He nodded slowly, unable to speak, but wanting her to know she'd been heard, seen, understood, in ways he hadn't allowed himself to be understood in decades. Magnolia stood and began clearing dishes with efficient gentleness, giving Frank space to process emotion without the pressure of eye contact. "The wall keeps out danger, but it also keeps out everything else," she said conversationally, running water in the tiny sink. "I built walls too after Luna's father left, before she was even born, before I even knew I was pregnant. Took me years to understand that walls don't make you strong, they just make you isolated. Strength is letting people see you're breakable and choosing connection anyway." Frank forced himself to breathe normally, to sit in this cramped kitchen with these two people who'd somehow looked at his expensive armor and seen straight through to the frightened child underneath. "I grew up in the system too," he admitted, the words emerging rough and unpracticed. "Foster homes and group facilities until I aged out at 18. I learned early that vulnerability was punished and hardness was rewarded, that the world respected strength and exploited weakness. I became very good at being hard. But hard things break," Luna contributed, demonstrating with her bread pieces how rigid things snapped while flexible things bent. "Mama taught me that with the props she makes. The ones that are too stiff always break during performances, but the ones that can move with the actors last forever. You're so stiff you're about to break, and that's why you were crying at the toy store. You're breaking, but you don't know how to bend." The metaphor was simple enough for a child, but profound enough to dismantle Frank's defenses completely. He felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure in the ice that had protected his heart for so long that he'd forgotten it was supposed to thaw. His eyes burned with the approach of actual tears, and he pressed his palms against them, embarrassed by the breakdown happening in front of relative strangers, but unable to stop the process Luna had initiated with her relentless compassion. Magnolia returned to the table and sat beside him rather than across, her presence close but not intrusive, offering solidarity without demanding anything in return. "It's okay to break here," she said quietly. "That's what this space is for. Luna and I have both broken here multiple times, and the theater caught us. These walls have seen every kind of crying and kept every secret. You're safe to fall apart if you need to." Frank's shoulders shook with the effort of containing emotion that refused to be contained any longer, years of accumulated grief demanding acknowledgement. He thought about the toy store rabbit checking its watch forever, about his own mechanical existence moving through days without purpose, about standing in front of windows wanting to break through into simpler worlds. Luna came around the table and leaned against his arm with her whole small weight, offering comfort through presence the way children did before learning to be afraid of adult pain. "I haven't cried actual tears since I was 9 years old," Frank managed, his voice wrecked. "Not when I aged out of the system, not when I built my first business. Not when I realized I'd become exactly the kind of person I'd been afraid of as a child. I trained myself not to feel, because feeling hurt too much, and now I don't know how to turn feelings back on. I'm successful by every metric that matters in my world, but I can't remember the last time I felt actually alive." Magnolia's hand found his shoulder with firm gentleness, grounding him while he unraveled. "Feelings don't turn back on all at once," she told him. "They come back in waves, when your nervous system finally believes it's safe to feel. You've spent decades in survival mode, and survival mode requires shutting down everything except what's necessary for getting through the next moment. You're not broken, Frank. You're exactly what any child would become if they had to parent themselves through a world designed for adults." Luna wrapped her arms around his bicep in an approximation of a hug, her cheek pressed against his expensive coat sleeve. "You can practice feeling here," she offered. "Mama says practice makes permanent, not perfect. Which means if you practice being sad and scared and happy and excited, eventually those feelings become normal instead of dangerous. You can practice on us because we already love you a little bit, even though we just met you, and love makes practice safer." The casual declaration of love from a child who'd known him less than 2 hours undid something fundamental in Frank's carefully constructed emotional architecture. A sound emerged from his throat that might have been a laugh or a sob, or both simultaneously, and tears finally came, hot and unfamiliar on his cheeks. He cried without elegance or control, making sounds he'd have been mortified by in any other context. But Magnolia and Luna held space for his breakdown, with the comfortable acceptance of people who understood that falling apart was sometimes the only path to putting yourself back together correctly. The kitchen was silent, except for Frank's ragged breathing and the occasional word of comfort from Magnolia, her voice low and steady, as she reminded him to breathe, that he was safe, that letting go didn't mean losing control forever. Luna maintained her grip on his arm, her small body a warm anchor that kept him tethered to the present moment, instead of drowning in decades of accumulated pain. Time passed in unmeasured increments until Frank's crying slowed, and then stopped, leaving him exhausted but somehow lighter, emptied out in a way that felt like relief rather than loss. He lifted his head finally, wiping his face with shaking hands, and found Magnolia offering him a clean dish towel, since they apparently didn't have tissues readily available. "I'm sorry," he started, but she cut him off with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument about his right to take up space with his pain. Luna had returned to her seat, but continued watching him with satisfaction, as if his breakdown had been an achievement, rather than an embarrassment. "Don't apologize for being human in front of humans," Magnolia said. "You've probably spent years apologizing for taking up space, or having needs, or showing weakness. You don't need to do that here. This is a theater, which means it's a place where people practice being more honest than real life usually allows. You just gave the most honest performance I've seen in months, and honesty is always worth witnessing." Frank had regained most of his composure when Magnolia suggested he might want to see the rest of the theater, while she and Luna finished cleaning up from dinner. His face felt tight from dried tears, his eyes probably red, but the embarrassment he expected never fully materialized, because neither Magnolia nor Luna treated his breakdown as anything unusual. They moved around him with easy acceptance, discussing tomorrow's performance schedule, while Frank stood on uncertain legs and tried to remember how to inhabit his body after emotions had temporarily displaced his usual controlled inhabitation. Luna took his hand again, her grip sticky from helping with dishes, but confident as she led him back toward the main theater space. "I want to show you Mama's office," she announced, navigating the narrow hallway with the assurance of someone who'd memorized every inch of the building's geography. It's really small and kind of messy, but she keeps important things there, things that remind her why the theater matters even when it's hard to keep running. The office turned out to be a converted coat closet, barely 6 feet deep, its walls covered with photographs and children's drawings and newspaper clippings about past performances. A desk that was really a door laid across 2 filing cabinets dominated the space, covered with paperwork and costume sketches, and what appeared to be grant applications in various states of completion. Magnolia's laptop sat closed beneath a coffee mug that advertised a theater company from 10 years ago, and a small lamp with a green shade provided the only illumination. Luna pulled Frank to a corkboard mounted on the wall behind the desk, its surface layered with memories pinned in overlapping chaos. Birthday cards from children who'd performed in shows, thank you notes from parents, photographs of casts from productions dating back years. "Mama saves everything that matters," Luna explained, pointing to a drawing she'd apparently made of herself as a rabbit. "She says memories are the real wealth because money comes and goes, but moments lived fully stay forever in your bones." Frank studied the collage with growing understanding of how Magnolia had sustained this theater through financial impossibility, by measuring success in impact rather than profit. His eyes tracked across images of children in costume, parents hugging their young performers, cast parties in this very space. Then his gaze snagged on a document in a plastic sleeve, official-looking with seals and signatures, and his breath stopped entirely as recognition flooded through him with disorienting force. It was an adoption certificate, Luna's name typed in formal legal language alongside Magnolia's, the date showing completion of the adoption process 4.5 years ago. But tucked behind it in the same plastic sleeve was a form Frank recognized with visceral clarity, because he'd signed hundreds of them 15 years ago, when he'd anonymously funded the renovation of the city's largest group home facility. The form listed the child's intake information, the facility name, and at the bottom in faded ink, a benefactor code number Frank had created to maintain anonymity while ensuring his donations reached children who needed them most. His hands trembled as he reached toward the corkboard without touching it, his mind making connections that seemed impossible but undeniable. Luna had been processed through the facility Frank had rebuilt from near condemnation, had lived in rooms he'd paid to make safer and cleaner and more humane. He'd never visited the facility personally, had maintained strict anonymity to prevent his name from being used for publicity, but he'd poured money into making it a place where children weren't just warehoused, but actually cared for during their temporary stays. "That's my adoption paper," Luna said proudly, unaware of the earthquake happening in Frank's understanding of how their lives had intersected before tonight. "Mama framed it because she says it's the most important document in our whole family. The paper behind it is from the place I lived before the foster family, the big house with lots of kids. I don't remember much about it except the rooms were clean and the workers were nice, and there was this stuffed rabbit in the playroom that I loved but couldn't bring with me when I left." Frank's vision blurred as 15 years of distance collapsed into present understanding. He'd funded that facility during a rare moment of looking backward instead of only forward, had written the check that renovated the children's wing, and trained staff, and added the playroom Luna remembered. He'd told himself he was investing in infrastructure, not sentiment, but the truth was simpler and more painful. He'd been trying to give unknown children the safety his younger self had desperately needed, and never received. "Are you okay?" Luna asked, noticing how still Frank had become, how his breathing had changed into something shallow and rapid. She tugged on his hand with gentle insistence, trying to pull his attention back from wherever it had gone. "You look like you saw a ghost, but Mama says this building isn't haunted except by good memories, though sometimes I think I see shadows that aren't quite shadows, but Mama says that's just my imagination being active." Frank forced himself to look down at Luna, this child whose survival path had briefly intersected with his anonymous attempt at redemption, and felt the weight of cosmic coincidence press against his chest. "I knew that facility," he managed, his voice coming from somewhere distant. "I helped renovate it years ago, before you were born. I wanted to make it better for the children who had to live there, to give them rooms that felt less like institutions and more like places where humans were supposed to exist." Luna's face transformed with wonder, her eyes going wide as she processed this information. "You made the rabbit room?" she asked, her voice climbing with excitement. "The playroom with the soft floor and the good lights and all the stuffed animals that were clean and not falling apart? That was you?" Mama tried to find out who paid for those renovations because she wanted to thank them, but the facility said the donor was anonymous and wanted to stay that way. Magnolia appeared in the doorway, drawn by Luna's raised voice, her expression shifting from curiosity to careful attention as she took in Frank's pale face and shaking hands. "What's going on?" she asked, moving into the cramped space with concern evident in her posture. Her eyes went to the corkboard, then back to Frank, reading something in his expression that made her own face soften with dawning understanding. "You're connected to Luna's intake facility somehow. I funded its renovation," Frank said, the words feeling inadequate to convey the magnitude of what he was experiencing. 15 years ago, I was building my businesses and drowning in success that felt hollow. I kept thinking about the places I'd lived as a child, the facilities that warehoused kids without caring whether we felt human. I wrote a substantial check to renovate the largest group home in the city, updated everything from the rooms to the staff training. I never visited, never wanted recognition, just needed to know I'd made it better for whoever came after me. Magnolia's hand rose to cover her mouth, tears forming in her eyes, as she comprehended the invisible thread that had connected these three people long before tonight's meeting. "Luna lived in that facility for 8 months before going to foster care," she said quietly. "The social worker told me it was one of the better-run homes, that Luna had been safe there even if she couldn't stay permanently. She said the facility had been renovated by an anonymous donor who'd transformed it from barely adequate to genuinely caring. I've thought about that donor so many times, wanted to thank them for keeping my daughter safe before I even knew she existed." Frank felt his legs weaken and reached for the desk edge to steady himself, the coincidence too large to process rationally. Luna had invited him to dinner because she'd recognized his loneliness, not knowing he'd already participated in her survival years before either of them could have predicted this meeting. The universe had bent in ways that seemed designed to force connection, to prove that his attempts at anonymous redemption hadn't been as isolated as he'd believed. His money had built the room where Luna played with the rabbit she'd loved, and now she stood before him wearing rabbit ears and offering him the family he'd never allowed himself to want. "I need to sit down," Frank said, and Magnolia quickly cleared paperwork from the desk chair, guiding him into it with gentle efficiency. Luna climbed into his lap without asking permission, her small weight grounding him while his mind spun through implications. She wrapped her arms around his neck in a hug that felt both comforting and demanding, insisting through physical contact that he remain present instead of retreating into the shock that threatened to overwhelm him. "You saved me before you even met me," Luna said against his shoulder, her voice muffled but clear. "Mama says that's what angels do. They help people without needing credit or thanks. You were my angel when I was really little, and now I get to be your angel back by inviting you to dinner. That's how the universe balances things out, by making sure kindness comes back around even if it takes a long time." Magnolia crouched beside the chair, her hand on Frank's knee, her eyes holding his with intensity that demanded he hear what she was about to say. "You think you're this hard person who only knows how to control and dominate, but 15 years ago you chose to care about children you'd never meet. You invested in their safety and dignity without needing anything in return. That's not hardness, Frank. That's love expressing itself the only way you knew how at the time, through providing what you'd needed and never received." Frank's arms came up to hold Luna without conscious decision, his body responding to her trust before his mind could construct defenses against it. She fit against his chest like she'd been designed to rest there, her breathing steady and calm, while his remained ragged with emotion. "I told myself it was just practical charity," he admitted, his voice breaking on the words. "Tax deduction and good business practice to invest in community infrastructure. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the child I'd been, stuck in places where nobody cared if we felt human or just survived. I wanted to make it better, even if I couldn't go back and make it better for myself." "You made it better for Luna," Magnolia said firmly. "Which means you made it better for me because she's my whole heart." That renovation kept her safe during the most vulnerable period of her life, gave her a foundation of basic care that probably helped her survive the transition to foster care, and eventually to me. "You participated in saving my daughter before I even knew she needed saving. That's not nothing, Frank. That's everything." Luna pulled back to look at Frank's face, her small hands framing his jaw with surprising gentleness. "Mama says the theater teaches us that we're all connected by invisible threads, that every person we meet is part of a bigger story we can't see all at once. You and me and Mama, we were connected by threads before we knew each other. The threads just needed time to pull us together so we could see the whole picture. Now we're here, and the picture is beautiful even if it took a long time to reveal itself." Frank looked at this child who spoke with the wisdom of someone much older, who'd survived early trauma and emerged with her capacity for love intact, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his own life. He'd spent decades believing his childhood had ruined him, that the abandonment and institutional living had made him incapable of normal human connection. But Luna had experienced similar beginnings, and had somehow remained open, had learned to trust again through Magnolia's consistent presence. If she could heal, perhaps he wasn't as permanently broken as he'd believed. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, the admission costing him but emerging anyway. "I don't know how to let people close or be part of something that looks like family. I've built my whole life around not needing anyone, around being completely self-sufficient. The idea of mattering to people, or having people matter to me, feels dangerous, like I'm setting myself up for the kind of loss I've spent 3 decades avoiding." Magnolia stood and pulled a second chair into the cramped office, positioning it so she sat knee to knee with Frank while Luna remained in his lap. "Nobody knows how to do it," she said with gentle certainty. "Family isn't something you know how to do. It's something you practice until it becomes real. Luna and I have been practicing for 4.5 years, and we still get it wrong sometimes. I still panic that I'm not enough, that I can't give her everything she deserves. She still has moments where she's afraid I'll send her back, but we show up anyway. We practice loving each other even when it's scary, and eventually the practice becomes the relationship." Frank returned to the theater the following afternoon without invitation, arriving 2 hours before Luna's performance with coffee from the expensive place downtown that Magnolia would never buy for herself. He found her backstage wrestling with a pulley system that controlled the forest backdrop, her face flushed with frustration and her hair escaping its ponytail in wild strands. She looked up when his shadow fell across her workspace, surprise giving way to something warmer that made Frank's chest tighten with unfamiliar feeling. "I brought coffee," he offered, holding up the cardboard carrier with its 3 cups, suddenly uncertain whether his presence was welcome or intrusive. "And I thought maybe I could help with whatever's causing that expression on your face. I'm not good with theatrical equipment, but I know my way around mechanical problems. Spent years fixing things that broke in places where repair budgets didn't exist." Magnolia accepted the coffee with gratitude that seemed disproportionate to the gesture, taking a long sip before explaining that the pulley system had jammed, and she couldn't afford to call a professional repair person before tonight's show. Frank set down the remaining coffees and examined the mechanism with the focused attention he usually reserved for business problems. Within 15 minutes, he'd identified a worn bearing and improvised a temporary fix using materials from Magnolia's prop closet, his expensive shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his hands dirty with grease. Luna appeared from the costume room wearing her rabbit ears and a dress made from what looked like repurposed curtain fabric, her face painted with whiskers and a pink nose. "You came back," she said with satisfaction, launching herself at Frank for a hug that left grease marks on her costume. "Mama said you might not because grown-ups sometimes run away after they show feelings, but I knew you were different. I knew you were the staying kind even if you didn't know it yourself yet." The performance was scheduled for 7 o'clock, giving them hours to prepare, and Frank found himself absorbed into the theater's pre-show rhythm with surprising ease. He helped Magnolia hang the repaired backdrop, carried costume pieces from storage, and listened to Luna practice her lines with the seriousness of someone preparing for Broadway. Other children began arriving with parents in tow, the cast of 12 ranging from ages 5 to 10, their excitement filling the small space with chaotic energy. Frank watched Magnolia transform from exhausted single mother to confident director, her voice carrying authority without harshness as she guided young performers through final rehearsals. She caught his eye once across the stage and smiled with such unguarded warmth that Frank felt something shift deeper in his chest, a recognition of attraction that went beyond physical beauty to encompass her strength and creativity and fierce dedication to these children. He'd spent years around beautiful women who wanted something from him, but Magnolia's beauty came from what she gave rather than what she took. The trouble arrived at 6:15 in the form of a man in an expensive suit who entered through the theater's main door without knocking, his presence immediately creating tension that Frank recognized from his own world. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted through intimidation rather than negotiation. Magnolia's face went carefully neutral as she approached him, positioning herself between the stranger and her young cast members. "Mr. Patterson," she said with cold politeness, "I thought we agreed you'd communicate through my lawyer about the building lease. Coming here during rehearsal violates the temporary restraining order I filed last month when you tried to force entry into my apartment upstairs." Her voice remained steady, but Frank heard the fear underneath, the knowledge that legal protection was only as good as its enforcement. Patterson's smile held no warmth, his eyes scanning the theater with obvious disdain for its worn condition and modest operation. "Your lawyer's been avoiding my calls, so I thought I'd deliver the news personally. The building's been sold to my development company as of this morning. Previous owner accepted my offer, which means your lease is void, and you've got 30 days to vacate. This location will be demolished to make room for luxury condos, which is a much better use of prime real estate than a money-losing children's theater." Magnolia's face went white, but her spine straightened with determination that Frank recognized as the moment before someone decided to fight rather than flee. "My lease has 2 years remaining with an option to renew," she said clearly. "The sale doesn't void existing legal agreements. My lawyer will have an injunction filed within hours, and if you're not out of this building in the next 60 seconds, I'll call the police for trespassing and harassment." Patterson's expression hardened into something uglier, his civilized veneer cracking to reveal the bully underneath. "Your little theater is operating on borrowed time, Ms. Chen. I've reviewed your financials through public records. You're 3 months behind on utilities and running on grant money that dried up last quarter. You can fight the eviction, but legal battles cost money you don't have, and I can afford to drag this out until you're buried in legal fees. Sometimes the smart thing is accepting reality instead of pretending poverty can compete with capital." Frank had been standing in shadow near the stage, watching the confrontation unfold with increasing anger that felt different from his usual cold fury. This wasn't strategic anger about business or territory. This was protective rage about someone threatening people who'd offered him kindness. He stepped forward into the light, his movement drawing Patterson's attention, and let his reputation precede him as recognition crossed the developer's face, followed by something that might have been fear. "Frank Castellano," Patterson said, his aggressive posture shifting to wary assessment. "I heard you'd been seen in this neighborhood, but I didn't realize you had interest in failing theater operations. If you're looking to invest in the property, I'm sure we can work out a partnership arrangement that benefits us both. My company could use someone with your connections to smooth the permitting process for the condo development." Frank closed the distance between them with controlled precision, his voice dropping to the quiet tone that people who knew him understood as more dangerous than shouting. The only arrangement we're going to work out is you leaving this building immediately and permanently withdrawing your offer to purchase. You're going to contact the previous owner and explain that you've reconsidered, that the deal is off, that you've found a more suitable location for your development elsewhere in the city. You're going to do this within the next 12 hours. Patterson's face flushed with indignation, mixed with calculation, clearly weighing whether Frank's reputation justified backing down from a profitable deal. You can't force me to abandon a legitimate business transaction, he blustered, though his voice lacked conviction. I've invested significant capital in the preliminary acquisition process. Walking away would cost me hundreds of thousands in sunk costs. Unless you're prepared to compensate me for those losses, I have every right to proceed with the purchase and development. You have no rights here, Frank said with absolute certainty, his presence filling the space with the kind of authority that came from years of making people understand when negotiation was over. You have a choice between walking away voluntarily or discovering exactly how unpleasant I can make the permitting process for every project your company has planned in this city. I know which aldermen owe me favors, which inspectors will find code violations that need immediate attention, which unions will develop sudden concerns about your labor practices. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never heard of this building. The color drained from Patterson's face as he realized Frank wasn't bluffing, that the threat was specific enough to be credible and delivered with the calm of someone who'd done exactly this kind of thing before. The developer's eyes darted between Frank and Magnolia, calculations visible as he reassessed the situation. This theater can't possibly be worth protecting, he tried weakly. It's operating at a loss. Serves maybe 100 families at most. You're threatening to disrupt my entire business over a hobby operation that'll probably close within a year anyway. It's worth protecting because I say it is, Frank replied, his voice allowing no room for debate. You're going to leave now. Withdraw your offer by morning. And if I hear you've approached Ms. Chen or this property again in any capacity, the consequences will be immediate and comprehensive. I don't make threats I'm not prepared to follow through on. And I promise you don't want to test whether I'm serious. The door is behind you. Use it. Patterson backed toward the exit with visible effort to maintain dignity, his expensive suit and aggressive posture deflated by the encounter. He paused at the threshold as if considering a parting shot, then thought better of it and disappeared into the evening. The silence he left behind felt heavy, broken by the breathing of children who'd watched the confrontation with wide eyes, and parents who looked uncertain whether to be grateful or terrified of Frank's intervention. Magnolia stood frozen for a moment before moving, her legs carrying her to Frank on autopilot, while her mind processed what had just happened. You didn't have to do that, she said, but her voice shook with relief that contradicted the words. I had a lawyer, a plan to fight the eviction through proper channels. You just made an enemy of a developer with significant resources and connections throughout the city. He could retaliate against your businesses, file complaints, cause problems you don't need. He won't, Frank said with certainty born from understanding how men like Patterson operated. He's a bully who relies on intimidating people without real power to fight back. The moment someone with comparable resources pushes back, he folds because his entire strategy depends on facing no meaningful resistance. By tomorrow morning, he'll convince himself that withdrawing from this deal was his idea, that he found a better opportunity elsewhere. Men like him need to believe they're always winning, so they rewrite history to preserve that narrative. Luna had been standing near the stage with the other children, but now she crossed to Frank and took his hand with complete trust. You were scary, she observed matter-of-factly, but scary protecting, not scary hurting. Like when Mama used her stern voice with the man who tried to steal props from backstage last year. She was scary then too, but it was the good kind of scary that keeps safe people safe and makes dangerous people leave. Frank looked down at Luna, then at Magnolia, whose eyes held complicated emotions he couldn't fully read. I'm sorry if I overstepped, he said, suddenly uncertain whether his intervention had been welcome or another example of him trying to control situations through force. I know you're capable of fighting your own battles. I just couldn't stand there watching someone threaten what you've built when I had the power to make him stop. Maybe that makes me the same kind of bully, just pointing my aggression in a different direction. It's not the same, Magnolia said firmly, her hand coming up to rest on his arm. Patterson was using his power to take something from people who couldn't defend themselves. You used your power to protect something vulnerable. Intent matters, Frank. The capacity for force isn't the problem. It's what you choose to do with that capacity. You chose to defend a children's theater from demolition. That's not bullying. That's being exactly who Luna saw when she invited you to dinner yesterday. Someone who's brave enough to use strength for protection instead of conquest. The parents of the other cast members had been murmuring among themselves during this exchange, and now one of them stepped forward with cautious gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. "My daughter's been in 3 of Ms. Chen's productions, and they've helped her confidence more than anything else we've tried. We've been terrified about losing this space. If you really can make that developer go away, you'll have saved something that matters to more families than you probably realize. This theater is a lifeline for children who don't fit neatly into normal school environments." The theater filled slowly as 7 o'clock approached, families settling into the mismatched blue chairs, while Magnolia made final adjustments to lighting and sound. Frank had taken a seat in the back row, intending to remain unobtrusive, but Luna had appeared and physically dragged him to the front, where a chair had been reserved with a handwritten sign that read, "Frank's seat. He's family now." The designation made something warm and terrifying bloom in his chest simultaneously. The house lights dimmed, and Magnolia's voice came through speakers that crackled slightly with age, welcoming the audience to the Cornerstone Theater and introducing tonight's performance of The Brave Little Rabbit. Her words carried genuine love for the story and the children who'd bring it to life. And Frank realized he was witnessing someone operating in pure alignment with their purpose. She wasn't just directing a play. She was creating transformative experiences for children who needed to believe they could be heroes despite their size or circumstances. The curtains opened on a forest scene that shouldn't have worked but somehow did, Magnolia's painted trees and clever lighting creating depth that transcended the small stage. Luna entered stage left as the rabbit, her movements careful and expressive, her voice clear as she delivered the opening monologue about feeling too small to matter in a forest full of larger, stronger animals. Frank felt his throat tighten watching her. This child who'd survived early abandonment and emerged with such grace. The story unfolded with simplicity that held profound truth. The rabbit discovering that courage wasn't about size or strength, but about showing up consistently for what mattered. Other animals dismissed the rabbit's offers to help, certain that nothing important could come from someone so small. But when danger threatened the forest in the form of the approaching storm, the rabbit's intimate knowledge of small spaces and hidden paths allowed her to guide everyone to safety. It was allegory so transparent, it should have been heavy-handed, but Luna's performance gave it genuine emotional weight. Frank found himself completely absorbed in a children's play, his usual analytical distance dissolved by investment in whether the rabbit would prove herself. Around him, other audience members leaned forward in their seats, children wide-eyed with engagement and parents smiling at the obvious moral lesson. The production quality was humble by professional standards, but the heart behind it elevated everything into something more meaningful than technical perfection could achieve. The second act introduced conflict through a fox character who mocked the rabbit's size while secretly fearing his own inadequacy, his bullying revealed as projection of internal insecurity. The parallel to Frank's own defensive mechanisms was so obvious he wondered if Magnolia had somehow rewritten the script overnight. The fox's transformation came not through punishment, but through the rabbit's persistent kindness, her refusal to mirror his cruelty eventually breaking through his armor. Luna had a monologue near the end where the rabbit explained that being small meant she noticed things larger animals missed, that her size was perspective rather than limitation. She delivered the lines directly to the audience, her eyes finding Frank's for a moment that felt like she was speaking specifically to him about his own fears of inadequacy beneath the armor of power. His vision blurred with tears he no longer tried to hide, letting them fall while parents around him pretended not to notice. The climax came when the rabbit faced the fox after he'd gotten trapped by his own schemes, and she had to choose between revenge and rescue. Luna's face showed the rabbit's internal struggle, the temptation to let her tormentor suffer, and the ultimate decision to save him anyway because that's what brave meant, doing the right thing, even when the person didn't deserve kindness. She extended her small paw to help the fox up, and Frank felt something break open in his chest watching this child embody the kind of grace he'd never allowed himself. The play ended with the forest animals recognizing the rabbit's courage, but the real victory was subtler. The rabbit had proven her worth to herself, and no longer needed external validation. She stood center stage for the final line, delivered with quiet confidence. Being small taught me to be mighty in the ways that matter most. The lights faded as the rabbit sat peacefully in her garden, no longer waiting for others to see her value because she'd learned to see it herself. The applause was enthusiastic but modest in volume, only 60 people's hands clapping in the small space. Yet it felt more significant than any reception Frank had received in his life. He stood with the others as the cast took their bows, Luna's face glowing with pride and joy, her eyes searching the audience until she found Frank, and waved with such exuberance that he waved back, without self-consciousness. Magnolia appeared from stage right to acknowledge her young performers, and Frank saw exhaustion and fulfillment warring in her expression. The audience dispersed slowly, parents collecting children and offering congratulations to Magnolia, while cast members changed out of costumes. Frank remained in his seat, uncertain of protocol and reluctant to leave the cocoon of this experience. Luna emerged from backstage still wearing her rabbit ears, but changed into regular clothes, making a direct path to Frank with the determination of someone on a mission she considered important. "You cried again," she observed, climbing into the seat beside him and studying his face with clinical interest. "But happy crying this time instead of sad crying. Mama says theater is supposed to make people feel things they usually keep locked up, that good stories are keys that open emotional doors. Did the rabbit story open doors for you? Did you see yourself in her trying to prove she mattered even though she started small?" Frank nodded because lying to this child felt impossible, her directness demanding honesty that would have seemed intrusive from anyone else. "I saw myself in the fox," he admitted, the one who bullied because he was afraid of his own inadequacy, who hurt others to feel powerful because he couldn't feel powerful any other way. "I've been the fox my entire adult life, Luna. I've spent decades making people afraid of me, because being feared felt safer than risking being rejected or abandoned again. But the fox got saved anyway," Luna pointed out with the stubborn optimism of childhood. "The rabbit saved him even though he'd been mean, because saving people isn't about whether they deserve it. It's about who you choose to be when you have power. The rabbit chose to use her power for rescue instead of revenge. You chose to rescue Mama's theater today instead of just watching it get destroyed. Maybe you've been the fox, but now you get to practice being the rabbit too." Magnolia joined them, sinking into the chair on Luna's other side with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd poured everything into a performance. "What did you think?" she asked Frank, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I know it's just a simple children's story, nothing sophisticated or artistically ambitious, but I write these plays hoping they'll plant seeds in young hearts, that maybe years later someone will remember the brave little rabbit and find courage they didn't know they had. Theater can't fix systemic problems or solve real-world cruelty, but it can remind people that transformation is possible." "It was perfect," Frank said, meaning it completely. "I've seen Broadway productions that cost millions, and didn't move me a fraction as much as watching Luna teach that fox about grace." "You didn't just write a children's story, Magnolia. You wrote truth disguised as fable, wisdom dressed in rabbit ears. That play is going to stay with me longer than any supposedly important cultural event I've attended in my life. You're not just entertaining children, you're shaping how they understand courage and kindness and their own capacity to matter." Magnolia's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly, touched in a way that suggested she rarely received recognition for what she was actually accomplishing. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you probably realize. Some days I wonder if I'm fooling myself, if this theater is just elaborate avoidance of facing reality. Friends from college have real careers and retirement accounts and health insurance that doesn't require jumping through bureaucratic hoops. I'm 30 years old, living in a converted storage room above a failing theater, pouring everything into something that barely breaks even. Hearing that it matters to someone helps me remember why I keep doing this." Luna yawned dramatically, her energy finally depleting after the adrenaline of performance, and she leaned against Frank's side with complete trust. "Can Frank come home with us?" she asked Magnolia. "Not forever home yet, because he probably needs time to practice, but just tonight. Home so he doesn't have to go back to wherever he lives that makes him so lonely. Our apartment is small, but Mama can make the couch comfortable, and I have extra toothbrushes from the dentist that nobody's used yet. He shouldn't be alone after crying at a play about rabbits being brave." Frank opened his mouth to politely decline, to insist he couldn't impose further on their kindness, but Magnolia spoke before he could. "The couch is lumpy and the apartment is tiny," she warned, "but Luna's right that you shouldn't be alone tonight. Not after everything that's happened in the past 24 hours. You've been cracked open emotionally, and being alone when you're that vulnerable is how people convince themselves to build the walls back up. Stay. Let us practice being family together. No expectations beyond just existing in the same space without pretending everything's fine." The invitation terrified Frank more than any business negotiation or physical threat ever had, offering something his defenses had no protocol for handling. But Luna's warm weight against his side, and Magnolia's gentle understanding in her eyes, made refusing feel like choosing death over life, choosing isolation over the possibility of connection. "Okay," he heard himself say, "I'll stay. But I'm buying you a new couch because I've slept on enough uncomfortable furniture to last a lifetime, and if I'm going to practice being family, I want to do it on something that doesn't require chiropractic intervention afterward." Magnolia laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded, and Luna squeezed Frank's hand with victorious satisfaction. They sat together in the empty theater, while Magnolia gathered her energy for the final tasks of locking up and securing the space. The stage lights cast long shadows across the mismatched chairs, and Frank felt the strangest sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to be doing. For someone who'd spent 32 years certain he wasn't meant for belonging, the feeling was revolutionary. 3 months passed with the strange acceleration of time that happens when days become meaningful instead of merely endured. Frank found himself at the Cornerstone Theater most evenings, arriving as Magnolia finished directing rehearsals and staying through Luna's bedtime. He'd purchased the building through a quiet transaction that Magnolia only discovered when property tax notices arrived in her name, his gift delivered without ceremony or expectation. The theater's financial situation transformed from desperate to stable as Frank connected Magnolia with grant writers who could articulate the program's impact properly. He learned the rhythms of theatrical production, the chaos of costume crises and last-minute script changes, the joy of watching children discover transformation. His empire continued running through delegated management, and Frank discovered that stepping back from total control didn't result in collapse. Luna had proclaimed him practice family, which meant he was expected at dinner 3 nights per week minimum, his attendance tracked with stars on a chart. She'd decided this transition required accumulating 100 stars, earned through presence and participation in what she called heart-sharing moments. Frank was currently at 73 stars and discovered he cared about reaching 100 more than any business milestone. Magnolia had become something Frank didn't have words for yet, their relationship evolving with careful slowness that honored both their wounds. They'd shared exactly 2 kisses, both initiated by her after evenings when conversation had drifted past midnight and the space between them demanded acknowledgement. She'd pulled back both times before things progressed further. Needing to protect Luna from attachment to someone who might still decide escape was safer. His penthouse apartment sat mostly empty now, a monument to the life he'd built when isolation seemed like victory. He kept clothes there, and occasionally slept there when Magnolia needed space, or Luna had school events that required maternal focus. But the theater's converted storage room had become more home than anywhere Frank had ever lived, its cramped quarters holding more warmth than marble floors ever could. Tonight marked Luna's 8th birthday, a celebration Magnolia had planned with the creativity that poverty demanded and produced magic, despite limited resources. The theater was decorated with streamers made from recycled paper, and a cake that Magnolia had baked herself sat waiting in the small kitchen. 12 children from Luna's school and theater classes would arrive soon, along with parents who'd become familiar faces at performances. He'd purchased gifts in secret consultation with Magnolia, learning that Luna wanted art supplies and books and a particular stuffed rabbit that matched her stage costume. But his real gift waited in legal documents he'd prepared with his attorney, paperwork that would require Magnolia's consent and Luna's enthusiasm, but would fundamentally alter their relationship. The papers sat in his jacket pocket, their weight both terrifying and right, representing a commitment he'd never imagined making. The party unfolded with chaotic joy, children racing through the theater space while parents supervised with varying degrees of attention. Luna presided over the celebration with queenly satisfaction, her pink rabbit ear hat replaced with a birthday crown Magnolia had constructed from cardboard and glitter. She opened presents with genuine delight at each gift, thanking her friends with the gracious manners Magnolia had instilled through consistent modeling. As the party wound down and parents collected their sugar-elevated children, Luna approached Frank with the particular determination that meant she'd been planning this conversation. "I have 73 stars," she announced, "which means I need 27 more before you become real family instead of practice family. But Mama says that sometimes rules can change if everyone agrees the rule doesn't fit anymore, and I think 73 stars is enough to prove you're staying." Frank crouched to her eye level, his expensive pants kneeling on the theater's worn carpet, without concern for cleaning bills. "What if I told you I've been carrying papers in my pocket all night that would make it official in a different way?" he asked. "Legal papers that would change my relationship to you and your mama, that would give me responsibilities and rights I've never had before. Luna's eyes went wide with understanding that came faster than her years should allow, excitement and certainty warring across her face. "Adoption papers?" she whispered, the word carrying weight that acknowledged its profound meaning. "You want to adopt me? Like Mama did? You want to be my real dad instead of just Frank who comes to dinner and helps with homework?" Magnolia had been standing close enough to hear the conversation, and now she joined them with tears streaming down her face and joy written everywhere. "We should probably discuss this like adults before involving an 8-year-old in major legal decisions," she managed through tears. "But yes, Frank, yes. If you're serious about this, if you're really ready to commit to the permanence and complexity of being Luna's father, then yes." The legal adoption process took 4 months of paperwork and home visits and interviews with social workers who needed assurance that Frank's background wouldn't create danger. His reputation had preceded him in uncomfortable ways, requiring explanations about the nature of his businesses and detailed financial disclosure that proved his income came from legitimate sources. He'd endured the scrutiny without complaint, understanding that protecting children from predatory adults required thorough vetting, even when the adult in question felt certain of good intentions. The finalization hearing happened on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse that smelled of floor polish and anxiety, with a judge who'd clearly seen every variety of human relationship. She reviewed the file with thorough attention, before looking at Frank with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Castellano," she'd said, "tell me why I should grant this adoption when your background suggests patterns of behavior incompatible with child rearing." Frank had stood with Luna's hand in his, feeling Magnolia's presence beside him as support and witness, and answered with complete honesty. "Because I was a child who needed someone to choose me, and nobody ever did," he said. "I survived by becoming hard and strategic and intimidating, by building walls so high that rejection couldn't reach me anymore. But Luna saw through those walls to the person I'd buried underneath, and she decided I was worth saving before I knew I needed rescue." The judge had listened without interruption, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to something resembling understanding as Frank continued speaking. "She's taught me that strength can be gentle, that power can be used for protection instead of domination. That family is something you choose every day through showing up with your whole heart," Frank said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "I can't undo my past or pretend I haven't made choices that hurt people in pursuit of survival and success. But I can choose how I use those lessons going forward, and I'm choosing to be the father I needed when I was 9 years old." Luna had squeezed his hand during his testimony, her small fingers offering encouragement that steadied him when the weight of his own history threatened to overwhelm his composure. The courtroom felt simultaneously too large and too small, the formal setting at odds with the intimate transformation being documented through legal process. Magnolia's hand found his shoulder, her touch grounding him to the present moment instead of letting him drift into the past he was describing. The judge's eyes had softened perceptibly, though her professional demeanor remained intact as she processed his words and their evident sincerity. "I'm choosing Luna not because I've suddenly become someone without flaws or darkness, but because she showed me that being imperfect doesn't disqualify you from being loved," Frank continued, looking down at his daughter who gazed up at him with absolute trust. She demonstrated through her own survival and thriving that trauma doesn't have to define your entire story, that you can carry wounds and still choose connection. "I want to honor what she's teaching me by becoming someone worthy of the faith she's placed in me, not through being perfect, but through being present." The judge had set down her pen and removed her reading glasses, studying the three of them with the careful attention of someone who learned to read truth beneath rehearsed statements. "Ms. Chen," she'd addressed Magnolia directly, "you've already adopted this child and successfully created a stable home environment on limited resources, adding a co-parent with Mr. Castellano's complicated background introduces variables that could potentially destabilize what you've built. Why are you willing to take that risk when you've proven you can parent Luna successfully alone?" Magnolia had straightened in her seat, her voice clear and unwavering when she responded to the question that acknowledged her strength while questioning her judgment. "Because Luna needs to see that people can change, that early trauma doesn't sentence you to permanent isolation, that choosing connection after learning to distrust is the bravest thing humans can do," she'd said. "Frank isn't destabilizing our family, he's expanding it by demonstrating that transformation is possible when someone loves you enough to see who you could become. I'm not rescuing him or fixing him. He's doing that work himself. I'm just providing the safe space where that work can happen." The judge had nodded slowly, making notes that would determine whether Frank's transformation would receive official recognition or remain legally irrelevant to his relationship with Luna. And Luna, the judge had addressed the child directly, with the seriousness that showed she valued the young girl's perspective as legitimate testimony. Do you understand what adoption means? That Frank would become your legal father with all the responsibilities that entails, that this isn't a temporary arrangement, but a permanent commitment. Can you tell me in your own words why you want this adoption to happen? Luna had stood without being asked, her small frame radiating confidence that belied her years, as she addressed the judge with the directness children possess, before learning diplomatic evasion. Before Frank found us at the toy store, I had Mama, and that was enough because she's the best person in the whole world, Luna had said clearly. But Frank was so sad and broken that I knew he needed us, and needing us made him part of our family before any papers said so. He's been practicing being my dad for months now, and he's really good at it even when he gets scared that he's doing it wrong. He helps with my homework even though math makes him frustrated, and he sits through my plays even when other kids forget their lines, and the show runs long, Luna had continued, her testimony delivered with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about this moment for weeks. He taught me that being strong means protecting people who are smaller than you, not hurting them, and he shows me every day that people who start broken can become whole. I want the adoption because Frank is already my dad in every way that matters, and the papers will just make official what's already true in our hearts. The judge had granted the adoption immediately following Luna's testimony, her decision rendered with unusual warmth as she acknowledged that she'd witnessed something rare in her courtroom, a family choosing each other with full awareness of the work required. She'd signed the documents that made Frank legally responsible for Luna's well-being, her flourished signature transforming their relationship from chosen to official. The moment the gavel fell, Luna had thrown herself into Frank's arms with victorious joy, and Frank had held her while trying to comprehend that he was now someone's father, that a child called him dad and meant it. Now, 6 weeks after the adoption finalization, Frank stood before the same toy store window where his life had changed. But this time, Luna held his right hand, and Magnolia held his left. The mechanical rabbit still checked its watch in eternal repetition, but Frank no longer envied its simple programming. The display had been updated for Valentine's Day, the miniature village transformed with hearts and flowers, but the rabbit remained in its burgundy waistcoat, forever reaching for time that didn't matter. Thank you all for following this story. If it touched something in your heart, if you saw yourself in Frank's loneliness or Luna's compassion or Magnolia's strength, please write in the comments where you're watching from. Your connection to these characters matters, and knowing this story resonated with you helps me continue creating narratives about broken people finding their way home. Please like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can discover that transformation is possible, that family is something we choose, and that it's never too late to let yourself be loved.